Okay, we are recording. Oh, where do I even begin? Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So today I want to talk about something that's potentially a little bit controversial, and that is whether or not books should have trigger warnings. And I hate saying the word trigger warning because I feel like it's a term that's become a little bit perverted in the online community. But this is something that was a topic of discussion in one of my Facebook writing groups, or a Facebook writing group that I'm in. And I saw a lot of differing perspectives. There's some people who say, yes, books should absolutely have trigger warnings if they contain content that could be disturbing to some people. And there were people on the other end of the spectrum that were like, no, people need to suck it up and get over being so oversensitive. And at first I was sort of in the latter group where I thought people these days tend to be extremely oversensitive and they just want to be angry about things, and because we want to express our free speech, that we feel like we're also entitled to just express anything that upsets us in any way. But as the conversation in the group went on and I had more time to think about it, I can kind of see myself a little bit in the middle, because to me this is a very gray topic. Is that the right term? This topic has a very big gray area. Let's first define what a trigger warning is. Now, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which I have on my computer behind you guys, the definition of trigger warning is a statement cautioning that content, as in a text, video, or class, may be disturbing or upsetting. So basically, a trigger warning is meant to warn someone of a potential trauma trigger. So I also have the definition of trauma trigger. I'm trying to enunciate and say these lots of T words. The definition is: a trauma trigger is a psychological stimulus that prompts recall of a previous traumatic experience. The stimulus itself need not be frightening or traumatic and may be only indirectly or superficially reminiscent of an earlier traumatic incident, such as a scent or a piece of clothing. So based on that definition, a triggering event could literally be anything. It really just depends on what triggers something in you, in some sort of feeling. Smell is one of the senses that very easily triggers past emotions or past memories, whether good or bad. For instance, anytime I receive a package or a letter or some item from my grandma, of course it smells like my grandmother's house, which brings back very good memories. But a smell, even if it's not directly coming from someone or something that caused some sort of traumatic experience, can still bring about those same feelings and memories in a traumatized person's mind. So if you really wanted to get down to it, essentially anything could have a trigger warning associated with it, such as perfume, or a certain phrase, or an article of clothing, or anything that can be associated with some sort of past memory. So that's literally anything that exists. And I can definitely understand why people would or would not think that a trigger warning for books is necessary. Of course, we have a rating system for movies, and depending on the contents that's in the movie, we determine who we think that should be appropriate for. And of course, every rating has a list of things that could be upsetting. For instance, it'll say rated PG, may contain sensuality, swearing, violence, blah, blah, blah. And these are all things that also appear in books. And books don't really have the same sort of rating system. We basically just group things based on genre, which doesn't always give a very clear indication of what the content is. I mean, of course, a children's book, you're not going to expect a whole lot of violence or swearing or anything in it, because if it were to have those things, someone would say this is not a children's book, you can't market this as a children's book because obviously it's not for children. And other genres are also very obvious, like erotica is going to contain lots of sex. The point of erotica is to contain lots of sex. So, obviously, erotica is meant for adults and people who are okay with reading and visualizing sexual experiences. But there is a lot of gray area when it comes to certain genres. For instance, something that is listed as young adult could contain nothing particularly troubling, or could contain sex, violence, drug use, and other stuff like that, and yet still be considered something that young people would read. Do I see that as problematic? Not really, but I tend to have a pretty thick skin for that sort of stuff, and there are some people who do not. So the whole point of this video isn't to say that my opinion is the be-all, end-all, and that I know what should or should not take place in books. And of course, an author can decide what they do or do not want to put in their book. Anytime that I have seen a trigger warning for a book, it's usually in maybe the online description or on the copyright page. But there are some people who've even talked about maybe putting it on the back blurb, like have the blurb, and if that wasn't descriptive enough about what could be within the book, they'll put on the bottom, contains violence and rape and blah blah blah, stuff like that. And I don't want to sound wishy-washy, but for me this really is a gray area, because I've often seen trigger warnings used on things that I wouldn't expect to really be triggering. And sometimes I do think people are being way too sensitive when they say that something has triggered them, when what they really mean is it upset them or angered them or, God forbid, went against their opinions. Having an actual trauma trigger isn't just something that upsets you or annoys you or makes you mad. It literally brings your brain and subsequently your body and all your feelings back to some sort of traumatic event. And it's also really hard to gauge how profound the content has to be in order to be considered triggering. I don't exactly know how movie ratings work, but I'm sure there's a certain criteria for the amount of nudity or the amount of violence or swearing or whatever that can appear in something before it's determined to be a higher rating. There have been books that have literally triggered me. As someone who does deal with mental illness, I have been legitimately triggered, as in, had like a flashback or, heightened emotions or something like that, without getting into too much detail, when I was reading a book. But did this ruin me? No, obviously I survived, and in pretty much every case, you do survive. It's not like being triggered is going to seriously injure you in some way. It's not comfortable, it's not fun, but it just is something that you can get over. And of course, exposure therapy is a thing, but on the other hand, there are people who have gone through difficult situations who aren't in that stage of healing where they want to be exposed to whatever their triggers are. And I've also read books where I had an idea that it was about a certain subject or was supposed to be for adults, but I wasn't prepared or expecting things that were within the book. The most prominent example that comes to mind is The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I watched the movies, the original, I believe, Swedish films, before I read the book, and the movies are rated R. I don't even have to look it up because just knowing what happens in the movies, I can tell that it's definitely rated R. There are pretty graphic scenes of violence and sexual assault that I didn't expect, and it was kind of scary to watch. And I can totally understand why movies need these ratings, because stuff within a movie happens very quickly and sometimes it's not easy to predict when something's going to happen. And because the action happens so quickly, it's not like you can just suddenly, someone's going to get hurt or something's going to happen and, turn it off or turn away or leave the room or something. Sometimes you're just stuck there dealing with it. So yeah, I can understand why movies need it, but the thing is with books, you can usually predict when something's happening because the overall narrative is much more drawn out and slow in most cases than a movie is. And if you get the sense that something troubling is going to happen, there's a very easy solution with a book. And that is closing the book and putting it away, or even flipping through very quickly until you've reached a page where the event is over. And maybe that's the reason why books aren't required to have trigger warnings or rating system besides their genres, because it is much easier to avoid things in books. And also the difference between something that is visual and happening right in front of you, like on a movie screen, and something that is in a book, is that when you're watching a movie, you are literally seeing the action or the scene exactly how it happens. It's very, for lack of a better word, visual. It tends to envelop much more senses than reading does. I mean, obviously there's no sense of smell when you're watching something, but you have dialogue, you have thematic music in the background, and you're seeing things exactly the way that they are depicted. Whereas with a book, you're only reading it and you're processing as much information as your brain can come up with, if that makes any sense. So if you're a very detailed reader and you're reading a very detailed scene and you're visualizing it step by step by step, I mean, yeah, you're going to feel more involved in it rather than if you're just kind of grazing over the page and not really absorbing all the details. And the thing with books is they are a little bit more open to interpretation. And so if I'm reading something, I might kind of breeze over it and think, okay, well, that was, bad, but not that bad. Whereas someone else might read over the same passage and think that it was horrible and traumatic and it caused them to close the book and throw it across the room. And I know that sounds a little bit dramatic, but there are people who seem to have those responses. The content depicted in books is a little bit more subjective than is depicted on a movie screen. So, after really thinking about it and trying to see both sides of the issue, I don't think my opinion about trigger warnings has really changed that much. While I can understand why some people would want them or would put them in their own book, I still don't think I would ever put them in my own books unless I did something that was really traumatic, in which case I would try to allude to it in some way in the blurb. And sometimes the blurb is the only thing that you have to really give you any idea of what the book's going to be about and what the mood is and stuff that happens. And even that would be really difficult because you don't want to give too much away. But for instance, if a blurb started out with something like, after a violent altercation with a coworker, so-and-so, blah, 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 this happens. It definitely tells you right off the bat that there is going to be something violent in there that you may or may not want to bother reading. And likewise, there are certain genres where you can kind of expect certain things. Like I said, erotica is going to be full of sex. Horror is probably going to have very scary images and probably violence, as well as crime and thrillers and other genres like that. But there are some genres where it's not necessarily apparent what is going to be inside the book. Fantasy and sci-fi, for instance, you're never quite sure if you're going to encounter some sweaty sex scene or, outrageous violence. And the same goes for young adult, where there are some young adult books that are very pure and clean, and there are others that you almost think should be adult. So I guess this video isn't really here to provide, a definite answer or to try and sway someone's opinion. Like I said, I don't intend to put trigger warnings in my books because what triggers me might not necessarily trigger someone else, and what triggers someone else might not trigger me. And without some sort of rating system, not that I want one, because I don't want to be forced to do certain things with my book. That's part of the reason why I'm an indie author in the first place. But I wouldn't be able to accurately say what triggers I need to put on the book, and I feel like that could potentially go into corruption of freedom of speech or something like that. So I'm really just here to try and open up a dialogue to sort of hear other people's opinions and see what you guys think. Definitely feel free to comment down below what your thoughts and feelings are, but of course, please be respectful of everyone and be respectful of me, because I don't want to have to go down there and become a sheriff or something, but I definitely do want to hear how people are feeling about this sort of thing. Do you think books should have trigger warnings or a rating system the same way that movies do? Do you think they shouldn't and we should just rely on the genre and what the blurb says, or something else entirely? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and we'll see if we can get some sort of well thought out, respectful conversation going on in the comments section. If you'd like to keep up with me on other social media, I will leave those links below in the description. If you'd like to purchase my young adult dystopian fantasy novel, it will also be linked below in the description, where you can pick it up on Amazon and on Kindle. So until next time, see ya!